So I want to move on then to another Derrida text, and this is the text that's called Differance, and it's the first text that can be found in a collection of his called Margins of Philosophy. And it's the written text of a lecture that he delivered in January of 1968 that is basically more or less the sequel to the Structure, Sign, and Play paper that he had delivered in 1966, where he had announced that the absent center of ontology now opened up the possibility for the play of signification. And so he's going to follow up on this by discussing one of the tools for this play of signification as difference. And so what he does is he starts out by saying, the paper actually begins in medias res. He says, I want to proceed therefore to discuss a letter, namely the letter A. And the reason that it begins, that it sounds as though you've just walked in the middle of a lecture and you didn't hear the early part of it, that's deliberate because he wants to avoid the idea of the quest for archive, for origins. Part of the problem, he says, with the metaphysical tradition, which has been logocentric, that is to say reason-centered, in the sense of reason's quest for archive, for original substance essentialist terms like ousia and substance and God and the soul, these fundamental archive terms that he wants to avoid. So he wants to begin in medias res and avoid this. He's countering this whole metaphysical tradition, which since Plato and Aristotle has been logocentric, he says, reason-centered, and it's also been a metaphysics of presence. Now, a metaphysics of presence is a metaphysics in which being, in the Heideggerian sense, is privileged over absence. Being is something like Heidegger's mode of Vorhandenheit, entities which are in a self-sufficient mode. The subject, the Cartesian cogito, which is self-identical, is in a mode of presence. The transcendental signified, whether it's God or being, is also a mode of presence. And the one who gives the speech maker, or speech itself, is privileged over writing because speech is closer to the source. Again, this quest for archive, the living individual person who is at the podium uttering his speech is generally regarded as privileged over the writer. Writing has been seen as part of this ontological pair, and one of the characteristics of the logocentric tradition is that it thinks in terms of fundamental oppositions between presence, absence, speech, writing, light, dark, male, female. It thinks in terms of these absolute oppositions that Derrida is trying to twist us free of and to move us out of so that we can do something different instead of thinking in terms of these basically cliches, metaphysical cliches. And so speech is privileged, it's phonocentric. The logocentric tradition has been a phonocentric one that has privileged speech over writing. Writing is regarded as a lack. It's a substitute. The dead author is substituted for the living author. The text is seen as something that is suffering from a privation, a fundamental lack. And he wants to correct this. And he does this by starting out and saying that the two French words, différence and différence with an A, that he spells with an A as a neologism, he basically invents it by substituting an A for the E, is that the two words are homophones, and they, as far as speech goes, they cannot be discerned. A text is required, and this is his attempt to restore a certain amount of privilege to writing. A text is required for the eye to register the difference, to see that an A has been substituted for an E. So the text is required there. And he thinks of the A as the letter A as a sort of pyramid, along with the associations that will bring the interior silence of the tomb. So he's playing around with all these ideas of silence and sound, phonocentric, logocentric, all these different associations of the metaphysical tradition. So we have difference. And then he proceeds to define what he means by difference, and he says that difference is basically, it's not a word and it's not a concept, which immediately takes the reader aback because, of course, it is a word and, of course, it is a concept. It's a little bit like Magritte's painting of a pipe that says this is not a pipe, whereas it clearly is a pipe, but yet it's a representation of a pipe, so it's actually not a pipe. It's something of that kind of thinking, where he says, difference, then, is not a word or a concept because it makes all words and concepts possible. It functions outside of all metaphysical systems because it will refer to the process of the play of differences within those systems that make conceptualization possible in the first place. And it is therefore a kind of meta-concept. So he's trying to counter the metaphysical tradition of thinking in terms of absolutes, thinking in terms of these conceptual pairs of absolutes, especially the absolute pair of presence versus absence. The metaphysical tradition is a metaphysics of presence, and he's trying to counter that, but not by opposing it. Derrida tries to avoid taking sides in oppositions. He's not siding with absence. He's trying to twist free of the tendency to think in terms of absolute pairs of opposites altogether. So then he moves on to then talk about difference. What is it? So he says that Saussure said that basically the relationship of the signifier to the signified is arbitrary. The signifier is an acoustic image. It's basically a word, and any word in any other language can substitute just as well for any word. It doesn't matter. And the signified is the concept that the acoustic sound, the acoustic image refers to, and the relationship between them is arbitrary. And Saussure also says, according to Derrida, that the identities of words and concepts would take on their meaning within a system by differentiating from each other. So it's the play of differences between words that give them their identities within a system. But he says that what Saussure doesn't ask then is the question that what makes this possible in the first place? What is it that gives to these traditional linguistic and metaphysical systems the possibility to do this, to conceptualize? And this is what the word différance refers to. It is the very possibility, it is a sort of anti-concept that refers, anti-concept because it's outside of all metaphysical systems, that refers to the possibility of conceptualization through the play of differences that makes those systems possible to begin with in the first place. And so différance is a sort of Joycean pun. He had been reading Joyce, and it's a sort of Joycean pun on both, that means both to defer in the sense of delaying something, and therefore it has this temporalization aspect to it, but it also means the spacing of difference, the differences between things and the spacing between them that make differences possible in the first place. So it's a kind of Joycean pun that refers to both space and time, both to temporal deferment in the Freud sense of deferring gratification, delaying gratification. The reality principle comes in to displace the pleasure principle, Derrida says, as a substitute. It enables it to delay gratification. So it's deferral also in that Freudian sense of delaying gratification. But it's also difference, differentiating, difference in the sense of one term is differentiated from another, nature is differentiated from culture, identity is differentiated from difference by the fact that they are opposite terms. And so terms within metaphysical traditional systems have the tendency to spring up in terms of pairs that gain their identity by opposing these terms to each other. But différance rather, is a term that exists outside of this process of conceptualization through the production of metaphysical pairs of opposites by referring to the very process itself of conceptualization through difference and also through deferral. Now, signifiers within these systems, every signifier itself bears traces of other signifiers. It's a little bit like, this is Derrida's theory of the trace, which is a little bit like Leibniz's monads. In Leibniz's monadology, every monad mirrors every other monad, and so each monad is like a shiny ball that contains mirrors of all the other monads. And in a sense, that's kind of what Derrida means by the trace. Every signifier takes on its identity by not only differentiating itself from every other signifier, but also by bearing traces within it of all the other signifiers. And so the trace is not something that is subject to conceptual oppositions. Traces are elements of signifiers that have been woven into other elements of signifiers, and they bear within themselves the possibility of their own erasure. And in his essay on Freud, where he talked about the essay on Freud and the Scene of Writing, he says that Freud had analogized the psyche to something called a mystic writing pad, which is a wax tablet with a piece of wax paper over it and a piece of celluloid over that, and when one writes on it, it's like an etch-a-sketch. Basically, you can see a line, but when you lift the wax paper and the celluloid up, the line disappears, but the trace is left behind, inscribed onto the wax surface, and that symbolizes, for Freud, that symbolized the unconscious, the repression of traces that remain in the unconscious of conscious stimuli that were conscious at one point but have sunken beneath the threshold and have left their traces behind. So the trace is one of the essential elements of Derrida's thinking, and it transcends the traditional metaphysical idea of conceptual dualities, the trace. And so this is, difference is then both the difference, the process of differentiation, but it's also the process of the fact that each signifier in a system defers its meaning to the other signifiers. For example, nature differs from culture, but it also defers to culture. And so all the signifiers within these traditional systems defer to each other, and they take on their meanings this way. So they all bear traces of each other. And difference is itself a trace, is itself a phenomenon of trace, and it can be substituted for trace or supplement, as you will. But basically the idea then is to escape from the traditional metaphysical capturing in terms of essential oppositions, pairs of opposites. Difference is not a proper name, so it doesn't have a capital D, because it's an anti-concept. It's not a word, it's not a concept, it's a meta-concept. It doesn't have a proper name, and it's not a proper noun, and it doesn't have a substance. It's not something that can be essentialized or substantialized in any other way. It's what allows us to twist free of all these traditional metaphysical systems, and it destabilizes these systems by introducing the play of signification into them that disrupts their meanings. And the meanings will begin to slide and shift as Derrida moves on with these other papers, and he introduces the concept of the undecidable, for example, where a lot of these trace words, such as the word pharmakon, which is Plato's word for writing, and it means both poison and cure simultaneously, so it's an undecidable, so it's a trace word that contains the play of its own difference within it. And there are a number of these trace words that contain this play of difference within them that twists them free of these metaphysical oppositions that are very absolutist. So in this paper in 1968, that's the gist of it, the upshot of it. Difference now becomes one of the main tools of deconstruction that Derrida is now going to proceed in this book, Margins of Philosophy. As he moves through these essays, he'll proceed to give concrete examples of the application of this process of infinite deferral of meaning. He also points out near the end of the essay where he's talking about Heidegger, and he says that Heidegger had said that being, the difference between being and beings has been forgotten. It has been occluded, and this occlusion has taken place without leaving a trace, without leaving any kind of trace whatsoever, that there was once a difference between them. And he says that this is another example of the trace, and the way that the trace works to destabilize meaning is that meaning in the present era, the present epoch, although the word epoch is to be used reservedly since it implies a history, the concept of history, which is embedded in all metaphysical systems, is how we understand meaning today, which is shifting, and it's no longer ontologically grounded in an ultimate transcendental signified that guarantees that meaning is something absolute. Meaning now shifts. And so the introduction of this rather Joycean word of difference, which is a play on deferral as well as difference, is the beginnings of his movement now into the deconstructive process, which we'll see coming up next in these next few essays.